On behalf of the committee, thank you all for joining us, and I'd like to hand it over to Dave and Michelle. Here you go, Dave.
Thanks, Dave. Good morning and Happy New Year, and welcome to this session. I'm glad you're all here. I put this together with the co-chair, Michelle O'Brien. Michelle did a similar risk communication session a few years ago with EBC, and it was successful, and we decided we wanted to do it again and update it. So we brought together 4 different speakers to present about risk communication, communicating with the public, providing best tips, best practices, and tips on how to do it. There will be some crossover material between the speakers, but each will provide their own perspective from their own experiences, background, and knowledge. And it's important for scientists, engineers, technical folks to know how to communicate with non-technical people, community, when discussing sites and complex matters. And we hope that attendees after today will go away from this session with some best practices and tips and how to communicate with the public about technical site matters. As Jackson noted, this is being submitted to the LSP board for 2 hours of CEU LSP credits, and there'll be some polling questions throughout. Everyone's welcome to answer the polling questions, but if you want the credit, make sure you do answer the polling questions. Shannon Gleason, a colleague of mine at AECOM, is our first speaker. She'll provide some basics of risk communication, what some of the challenges are, and best practices and examples. She is a professional engineer with over 30 years of experience in environmental consulting, and the last 15 years she's been heavily involved as a community relations and communicator manager on a number of large, complex projects in various Northeast states. So Shannon, it's all yours.
All right, good morning, everyone. And thank you, Dave, for inviting me to present today. The presentation I have to offer today is a compilation of information about risk communications, the basics, communication challenges, and best practices I've assembled over the last 15 years, where establishing good working relationships with affected stakeholders or community was critical to the project's success. So what I've done is I've assembled, parts and pieces from key resources and risk communications and boiled them down to what I believe are the keys to a basic understanding of risk perception and risk communication, and important for us practitioners to truly embrace when faced with difficult or challenging community relations situations. So I'll dive right into it. So what is risk communication? Let's start there. Risk communication is the exchange of information among interested parties or stakeholders about the nature, the magnitude, the significance, or control of a risk. The goals of risk communication are to enhance a community's knowledge and understanding of a site, build trust and credibility so that the site or remedy decisions are accepted, encourage dialogue. Yes, we do need to certainly listen to the community and address their concerns, and ultimately perhaps to influence attitudes, decisions, and behaviors. So the engineer in me likes to think about this from, maybe a science standpoint. So if you all would do me a favor, close your eyes for a second. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to give you a little scenario and then ask you to open your eyes and then close them again. And when you open them, I'm going to show you a picture. So imagine that it's perhaps springtime, early to late spring maybe. And you're walking in the grass alongside a wooded area. Perhaps it rained yesterday and the grass has a light dew on it. Perhaps the sun just came out and you come across, open your eyes, close your eyes. All right, you can open them again. So this works a little better with, I'm in a big conference room with a lot of people there, but I'm curious, did some people perhaps see a snake? Did some people perhaps know right away it was a stick? Well, I got to tell you, this actually situation is real. This is a picture from my backyard. One day I was walking the dog and came across this. And of course, you know, the first thing that happened to me, I don't like snakes. So the first thing I did was like, oh, and, you know, try to, you know, my heart started beating a little faster. Maybe I was starting to get a little sweaty. But as soon as my brain caught up, you know, you can, my brain catches up and says, it's a stick, relax. You know, so I want to talk a little bit about the biology of, oh, for some reason, Jackson, I can't,
Advance.
I can't switch the slides anymore. Yeah.
You just have to click into the PowerPoint specifically so it registers that you're.
Oh, there we go.
Yep.
Right. All right. Sorry about that, everyone. So, you know, the biology of what's going on when you see something that you fear is important to talk about. So what you're seeing, the optic nerve, and that's this area right here. The optic nerve sends a signal to the amygdala, which is that's the area, that's the thinking center, or that is the center. Sorry, that is the engine, I guess, of the brain, and it sends a signal to the hypothalamus, which controls your reactions, and then the cortex, which controls our thinking. Well, you'll notice that the signal length from the amygdala to the hypothalamus is a lot shorter than the signal from the amygdala to the cerebral cortex. So what's happening is that our body is starting to react. You know, our palms get sweaty, our heart rate starts increasing long before your brain is telling you that it's just a stick, you can relax. And, you know, while this might be understandable from a situation of, you know, thinking you see a snake or seeing something, you know, perhaps other people have fear of, you know, mice or perhaps of spiders, you know, your body's going to react the same way. But I think it's important to understand that, you know, there are people in the community that have these same, you know, notions of fear based on if they hear the word PCB or if they hear contamination or if they hear hazardous. So it's important that our perception of these risks, you know, and what is going on in the brain and what we need to do to counteract these signals. So these sensory inputs that invoke these strong reactions like fear form these strong neural circuits. Our first impression of a risk, oh my gosh, it's a snake, forms this physical circuit that represents fear. You know, my heart rate increases, my adrenaline spikes, and invokes these reactions that represent safety, like I'm gonna get the heck away from here. So all the subsequent information we see or hear has to fight to undo these circuits. Our body eventually equilibrates and we can move on. We can pick up the stick and we can throw it in the woods. So how do we break this cycle? Well, we communicate. We do it strategically. You communicate with words and wisdom and frequency that will counteract the signals emanating from the amygdala to send positive, reinforcing, and assuring messages. Over time, those messages will be incorporated as knowns within the cerebral portions of the brain and will serve as a dampening feedback to the reactionary portions of the brain. So it's been suggested by risk communication, training, and literature that risk is not just the hazard represented by the site, but it's also people's perceived outrage about the hazard. So risk equals hazard plus the outrage. The public generally responds more to the outrage than the hazard. So people's general response to risk is not quantitative like scientists and engineers like to give the numbers of 10 to the minus 6, but it's really about how scary it is. So outraged people are not going to pay much attention to the hazard data, so it's pointless to ignore the outrage and just focus on the hazard. Outrage is not a distraction from the hazard. You need to accept both are legitimate and important and create your risk communication plan to address both. You know, more often than not, the goal of risk communication might be to reduce the outrage. You know, what makes people more outraged is their perception of the risk. So these perception factors are a little bit like seesaws. They'll make the fear go up or down. For example, the public's fear of cancer is relatively small, while the actual percent lifetime risk of dying of cancer is 22% in men and 19% in women. Another example is we all think we're very good drivers. Well, the risk of a car accident is really on the order of 1 in 100. So any given time, there are a number of factors that are involved, in our perception of the risk. More often than not, it could be one factor at a given moment and another factor at another moment. So our perception of the risk can be modified based on a number of factors. People have less intense and less fearful emotions toward the risk, the more likely they are to accept it. For instance, if people perceive a risk to be voluntary, they're more likely to accept it because they understand their role in experiencing the implications of that risk. If people perceive a risk to be something that's from a natural source versus a man-made source, they're more likely to accept it. So in risk communication, there are generally 4 stages of this outrage management, back to talking about the outrage management. So this graph on the right here, hazard is on the x-axis, low hazard to high hazard, and the outrage and fear is on the y-axis, low to high. If the hazard is low and the outrage is low, then there's really no need for risk communication, and hence there's no circle on the graph. If the hazard is high and the outrage is high, your risk communications are in the stage known as crisis communications, and that's a presentation for another day by perhaps another speaker. If the hazard is high, but the outrage is low, risk communications are in the stage known as precaution advocacy. So this might be for a situation where you're trying to influence a behavior like wearing a seatbelt. Like I just gave the example of a car accident, or perhaps wearing a mask in these days of COVID. More often than not, though, we are in the situation of perhaps there's a low hazard at the site, but there's a high outrage. So what do? Well, we listen, we allow the outraged person to express their concerns, we respond, we give the community the information they're looking for, and we acknowledge prior mistakes and wrongdoings, but also the similarities and differences. We stake out the middle, not the extreme. We get the underlying issues on the table, don't hide them or ignore them. We acknowledge the current problems, again, don't hide them. And we discuss achievements, which is important, but we do so with humility. That said, there are difficulties in communicating risk. There are characteristics and limitation of the scientific data about risk. We are full of numbers and acronyms and lingo. There's some of the other difficulties, officials and spokespersons who communicate risk. So more about that in a minute, but the media in reporting risks. I'll never forget working on a gasoline spill, and the local media used a radioactive symbol to introduce the news story. And there are certainly some limitations as well. Oops, sorry about that. In the public in evaluating and interpreting risks. They're not scientists and engineers. So we need to give them the information and the tools needed to support their understanding of the situation. So back to the limitations of spokesperson. I've always found this particular slide very meaningful to me. Spokespersons who have high trust and credibility are generally respected local citizens or non-management employees. And spokespersons who have perceived lowest trust and credibility are lawyers and environmental consultants for for-profit firms. So when we're in a situation of a public meeting or the need to be in front of the public, it's important to think about who your community is going to trust and find credible, and create ways for that trustworthy source to get the message out to the community. So 7 rules for risk communication. Accept the public as a legitimate partner, plan carefully and evaluate your performance, listen to your audience, and most importantly, and I give this advice probably most often, is to be honest, frank, and open. It's when you're not being honest, frank, and open that things tend to backfire. Coordinate and collaborate with other credible sources. For instance, some of those sources who might be higher on the trust and credibility scale. Meet the needs of the media, and speak and write clearly and with compassion. This might be a little touchy-feely, but honestly, they want to know you care before they care about what you know. So how do we communicate risk? Well, we establish trust and credibility. Only when this has been established can the sharing of information, can the true sharing of information follow. Research has shown there are 4 factors that influence our credibility. And the most important one, 50% of it, is if we're perceived as being caring and empathetic. The other 3 factors that give about the same weight is if we're perceived as competent, if we're perceived as honest and open, and if we're perceived as dedicated. A little bit more about presenting scientific information. Acknowledge your uncertainties, don't over reassure, be transparent, again, being open, honest, and frank, don't speculate, use accessible language in reports. We scientists and engineers love lingos and acronyms. Too much text, too many big words, too many brochures, negative language. So putting this all together, best practices. 1, anticipate the potential scenarios or situations you might be faced with and the potential stakeholder concerns at each situation. Prepare your key messages, who or how the message will be delivered, and practice. This is really important. Drills, exercise, rehearse, dry runs, and make sure you practice the questions and answers. A little bit more about each one of these. Anticipate. We know what questions the community will ask. We can anticipate the scenarios we may be faced with. Sit down and think about it as if you were in the shoes of the affected community. You want to know or hear. How might you react? And then review the project timeline and milestones. So there's a general understanding of when these situations might occur and when the team should be prepared. Prepare a communications plan. What are your communication goals? What are your reasons for conducting those communications? What events require or may warrant the communications? Who is your potential audience? What are your key messages? What do you need to tell your audience? Who do you want to convey that message? And what vehicle do you want to use? And what is the timing of these communications? And then prepare those key messages. Prepare responses to these tough questions that will be asked. Sit down and brainstorm what the hard questions will be and prepare the responses. Identify a consistent key contact. And I think this is important. It's really difficult to have many different sources providing different answers. Figure out the questions, define the answers, and have designated trustworthy spokes. Well, ideally 1 spokesperson, but sometimes there needs to be 2 or 3. Identify the vehicles to disseminate the information. See it, hear it, read it. Provide multiple opportunities for involvement. People learn in different ways. Gone are the days of, decide, announce, and defend. And certainly, practice. Don't be caught off guard. My mantra is always that it's better to be proactive than reactive. There have been public meetings where we've been planning and we plan as if we're going to have 100 to 150 people and maybe 10 people show up. Well, that's okay. And you're always better to be prepared. And so again, that you're not reacting to a situation you weren't prepared for. So Jackson, how am I doing on time? I do have a couple of project examples.
You're doing good. You still have about 5 minutes.
All right, wonderful. All right, so just a couple of project examples. This one was a gasoline spill, about 50,000 gallons of gas from an underground pipeline from a tank to a truck loading area, where, and you can, in this picture to the right here, you can see the houses in the background. Here's the tank farm, and here's the houses in the background here. There was an emergency response. I won't go into the details, but I will show you this slide. After the investigation, this is the gasoline plume that is underneath these houses in the background here. So this was a situation where I was really, really impressed with the whole team that came together, including the client, the environmental consultant, the regulators, and local regulators, the local health department as well. And the community or the company really embraced their responsibility and truly desired to make this right for their customers. Now, they replaced underground piping, they sealed sumps in people's basements, but in order for that, and this was a site where the first we had a series of 3 to 4, I think it was, public meetings over a span of 7 months. In the first public meeting, there were 150 people there. And even the environmental police were there because they thought it was going to get very unruly. And by the time we had, 7 months later, and we had our 4th public meeting, there were about 15 people there. And I think the keys to that success was the communications plan. We had everybody, no matter what side of the table you were on, whether again you were a regulator, consultant, a client, the local regulator, we all worked together to develop the communication plan, think about the questions. We were prepared to answer them. The company's quick and efficient and meaningful response, it ended up with these officials essentially sitting on the client's side of the table because they had, client was trustworthy to them and was doing the right thing. So again, that whole the perception to the community is that this group of people is really working together to make this situation right for them. So it was a very successful project in the end. And then the other project example I have, this is a community where the docs on the page over here are, we sampled soil on 150 homes for mercury and lead. We ended up doing a soil remediation for mercury. All those yellow dots there are properties where we needed to remove soil to remove mercury in soil. And this started out as client very concerned about potential legal suits, and again the communications plan that was put together for this project, which also involved the majority of the homeowners in this area were Spanish speaking, and the communication together and having two on-site representatives, one from the company and one community liaison who was Spanish speaking, really went, the community really embraced what the company was doing and appreciate all the efforts that were made. And in the end, there was no, knock on wood so far, there was no legal suit filed, and these properties have been remediated and a successful project. So with that, I will leave it. I will stop here.
Thank you, Shannon. Our next speaker will provide a perspective in regards to best practices in risk communication by providing 7 tips with legal and non-legal considerations. The speaker is Earl Phillips. He's an attorney and partner at Robertson & Cole LLP in Hartford, Connecticut. He is the founding chair of his firm's environmental and energy group and has taught various courses in environmental law and policy at universities and graduate programs in the Northeast, including Wesleyan University College of Environment and Tufts University Grad School. So Earl, you're up.
Excellent. Well, good morning, everyone. And again, thank you, Michelle and David. I know that, some of what I will cover in terms of the tips will be a repeat of what Shannon hit. And Shannon, thank you for covering so many of the things. Obviously, I will emphasize a few from my perspective that have been driven home by personal experience. This chart or something like it, I'm sure looks familiar to almost everyone in the room. I put it up here. It looks clinical. It feels clinical when I put it up on the screen. But frankly, as recently as a week ago, with respect to 2 brownfield sites in Rhode Island and 1 down in Pennsylvania, I was walking through a chart that looked not unlike this. This one happens to focus on the consequence and the likelihood, and the client wanted that. But then as we drilled down, we started saying, well, gee, there are the personal injury issues that are highlighted here. There are the additional remediation risks that might be necessary. There are property damage potentials at a third-party site. There are always the question of natural resource damages. And we realized, okay, so you go from this chart over to something more detailed, which is a chart that on one axis might have likelihood and on the other axis would have magnitude. And I find that one to be even more valuable than the one that I put up on the screen. But, you know, while they look clinical, I think for me, having that risk conversation, whether it's with a private sector client or a public sector client, it's terribly important to have that matrix or several matrices sort of front and center, just to guide the conversation, to allow the audience to understand which boxes are being checked off, which ones we should spend more time, frankly, thinking about or having a conversation about. Beyond the brownfield or redevelopment context, where I found that to be absolutely critical, we have another matter coming up right now that has gone through, and I know many of you on the line today have this same experience, have gone through closure of a treatment, storage, or disposal facility, have moved into post-closure, and are now entering and looking at the tools available for post-closure, whether those are orders under the Resource Conservation Recovery Act, or a stewardship permit, or something like it if your state provides for it. This has also been critical for us. Using these types of tools has also been critical in the risk assessment conversation and in the buyer, lender, investor, seller conversation. Again, so I wanted to make sure that as sort of one of the things to talk about, it's, how do you go to those conversations with the various audiences? Obviously, it's not a terribly important or perhaps the most valuable tool in having the public conversation, but there are lots of other risk conversations that demand it. I wanted to open with one little story, and hopefully with each of these, there'll be a lesson that I've learned or a lesson that was reinforced that I should have learned at some earlier point. Years ago, I moved up to New England, even before we had a group of friends who moved back to New England from various graduate schools and various parts of the country. And we thought, wow, it would be great. We'll buy a lovely little cost us nothing cottage up in Vermont. It will be spectacular. It'll be our little vacation commune. And it was a great idea, and it served us well for years. But we went to the closing. There were 8 of us buying this little cottage together, and we went to the closing. And you do the pre-closing inspection, right? You always do your walkthrough immediately prior to buying something. And as we walked through this little cottage, we went into the basement, of course, to look and make sure it wasn't flooded and it was all okay. And the basement was filled with 55-gallon drums. That's not a good thing. And for me, it was real, you talk about that situation where you see the snake. For me, it was, oh my God, this is really bad. Someone has dumped 55-gallon drums. I immediately cautioned every one of my partners to be and said, we can't buy a home with a basement full of 55-gallon drums that weren't here 3 weeks ago when we decided to buy this place. We go over to the closing. I'm confident that I'll be able to carry the day. And the lawyer on the other side says, oh, well, you have to take it as is because the seller has frankly already moved out of state. I look to my partners and say, well, obviously we can close in escrow. We won't close today. We'll take a pass on this particular moment. I was not a very effective risk communicator. I failed miserably. We actually, I was overridden by my partners, and we went back to the house after that, having bought this house with the 55-gallon drums in it. And of course, I did the appropriate thing, said, we're going to get a consultant in here and make sure that it's properly taken away and removed. And I'm having a visceral meltdown in the spectrum of seeing the snake. My pulse is going, my blood pressure is up. My face is red, only to realize that 2 of my friends and partners to be in this venture had already pried the top off of the 55-gallon drum and were gladly announcing and proudly announcing that it was filled with all sorts of dried fruits and nuts. And it was the storage, obviously, for the local co-op. So we had a basement full of nuts and dates and fruits and other delectables as part of the acquisition. Why did I tell that story? Just to highlight, and I think it's true in most of our experience, to highlight how different our personal experience can be. As an environmental lawyer, as an environmental consultant, you are seeing the world through a lens that is unique. I think we forget that because we're surrounded by these conversations all the time. But for others, they're looking at some things as no risk that may be very significant risk to each of us. They're looking at some things as high risk that we may have bracketed, analyzed, and put into a box and said, oh, that's not presenting much risk. And so I always remind myself of the context and the audience. And the audience can be highly varied, as we all know, depending on the number of folks who you're speaking with. And I highlight a few of these. Each of these has been driven home to me in various other experiences: the personal experience, the motivations behind the parties, the media exposure that they've had in other parts of their life, their beliefs in the political system or religious. And I've certainly had some instances where religious beliefs have been extremely important. I've had to spend time understanding those in other parts of our country, and also faith in government. And again, that's punctuated by just recent events in all of our lives. But there are great differences that many on the line have in terms of having a faith in government. And many of us have served in provided public service, and then the perspective that others may have. And then there's our Paleolithic hardwiring. And I'll go on from there with the next. I won't repeat this because this is really, I was going to make the same point that Shannon made, I thought, really well. And it really is, the reminder to me is that when a part of our audience has a scare, a concern, a health risk, a devastating, economic consequence to a transaction, that blink with the snake is not just that they see something different than might be there, but that blink is something that is sort of imprinted indelibly. The people who see that snake in that moment walking down the path remember that walk for a long time. Remember it, whether they are fright and flight, fright and freeze, or fright and fight. They remember that moment versus the person who sees it, oh, it's just another stick along the side of the road. They're far less likely to remember that moment. And it's up to all of us as people communicating in the risk terrain to recognize that it can take time and effort, as Shannon said, to overcome that moment where the imprint is strong, if not indelible. Shannon took you through this, so I won't repeat it. It is something that I've looked at and studied, not with the same scientific degree that, I'm sure all of you or many of you have, but I'm well aware of it. I've read about it, I've thought about it, and it's important because it ends in that imprint. In my mind, the imprint is something that we all in the risk area have to speak to directly and often have to overcome. The other thing I keep in mind, and I link tip number 2 and tip number 3, is that there are different reactions. There certainly is fright and flight. And in those instances where I have sensed that in a meeting, in a conversation, in a hearing, where someone is just going to push back from the table and either mentally disengage or physically disengage, I think that the challenge of the risk communication person is to help them re-engage, help them stay in the conversation, and to frankly avoid polarizing interests at that moment. And sometimes I've, in meetings involving risk, have almost had to say, if now or if today is not a good time to have this conversation, it's an important conversation. We want to make sure that it happens at the right time and through the right vehicle. But I think it's something we all have to be sensitive to, and acknowledge that people react differently when they're concerned, fearful, or anxious. The fright and fight, we've all experienced that. We've all had public meetings, public hearings, or even private negotiations where you sense the other person, if they had a tomato in their hand, would like to throw it at you. Again, to me, that is an opportunity to, through communication, to diffuse that anger and really then allow for some productive conversation. Not always easy, but always important. Shannon made a very good point, I think, in saying that, part of that can be overcome. Part of that can be accomplished through the repetition of the message. And I'll come back to that in a second. And then there's the fright and freeze. Now, how many of us haven't had this situation? Because they used to just say fright and flight or fright and fight, but there's the fright and freeze. Gee, that risk assessment that you guys have done is awfully complicated. It's perhaps breaking new ground. The agency person you're dealing with, the risk assessment reviewer, is not all that comfortable, is certainly doesn't want to make a mistake. And as a result, you sit there with a project that doesn't move forward, but doesn't move backward. It's not that they feel that you have done something wrong or incorrect, or that you've used a methodology that's not appropriate. But in that instance, to my mind, communication, the art of communication to encourage the decision-making is absolutely essential, and finding ways, even if it's incremental, to allow that decision-making to occur and forward motion in a project, whether redevelopment or remediation, to occur is essential. I think, you have to keep almost reminding folks of what's the alternative. It stays as is. That's not a good alternative in most instances for anyone. My punctuation here, of a personal experience was, a number of years ago. It was 8 o'clock in the morning. I didn't have my second cup of coffee yet. I was stopping at the local Dunkin' Donuts, and I got a call, and it was a very short call. It says, please, if you can in any way, get your car too. And then the address was given. I'll call you back shortly. And as I turned my car in that direction, I wasn't sure what was going on, but I obeyed the instruction, and soon after got a second call back explaining that there had been a terrible levee, an explosion, a fire. It wasn't clear whether people were injured or killed. Can you be there? And, I spent the next 2 weeks at this particular site. Now, the crisis management and crisis communication is one thing, but at some point, any crisis has to transition, not necessarily to business as usual, but business as a new usual, in my experience. And knowing how to do that and knowing when to do that is important. But also recognizing that for people who were evacuated in this community, people who are evacuated as employees, people who are investors in this particular facility, and we all have these experiences, all need to be in a position of reversing that heavy imprint that is a lasting imprint of fear and concern as they reintroduce themselves to what they never thought of as necessarily a risk situation, but now may think of as a risk situation, and converting that history and that imprint into something that is an acceptable outcome for them, and an acceptable outcome for the various audiences that you may be speaking to, is challenging. But to Shannon's point, I think it's done with a recognition of the efforts involved, the time spent, the information flow that's provided. And that information flow, to repeat something Shannon said, because I've experienced it over and over again, it has to be scheduled, regular communications, reliable communications, heavily fact-based communications, as opposed to, anecdotal or silly comparisons. People want and people need information in these situations to overcome that heavy imprint that may otherwise serve as a barrier or be a barrier. Hold on one second. There we go. I think this was, in one of Shannon's slides as well. Some level of, I call it agency, but some level of control or influence in the outcome can be terribly important. Several years back, I was the lead counsel for a matter in which there was a 3 to 4 mile plume extending along the Wasatch Front. And in that matter, the search was for how to remediate. And this, pump and treat along the Wasatch Front is not like it is in New England. It's not, the groundwater is not at 10 feet. It's at hundreds, if not thousands of feet down. It's an arid environment versus a humid or wet environment. And so there are different concerns. In this particular part of the country, I also had to make sure I really understood the heavy influence of the Mormon religion and the Mormon faith and what it meant and what it doesn't mean. And that was, again, an important part of understanding the audience and understanding the context. In this situation, there was a need, for pumping and treating the groundwater, but the constituents we were dealing with were not constituents that, find themselves on the page in the Safe Drinking Water Act with maximum contaminant levels or maximum contaminant level goals. They were more exotic than that. And as a result, there wasn't a clear, bright line for, what is safe. We had done a lot of science, others had done a lot of science. And what we wanted to do is pump this groundwater, treat this groundwater, and then reuse it. But of course, and that would have various benefits, we thought, to the community, and in terms of a potential natural resource damage claim, getting this resource back to something that would be productive was going to be very important overall. Initial community reaction was hostile, as you might expect. We worked for years in meetings going back and forth. But what the learning lesson was here is control. Ultimately, we gave folks control over two very important things to them. What would they like those treatment structures where the groundwater treatment is going to occur to look like in terms of an ultimate end use when the treatment was complete? And in the bottom right of that plate, you see, a couple different versions, one of which will be the town center library, at the end of the day. The other choice we gave was, it's not something that you have to use this resource. This is an arid environment. We realize water is precious, but at the end of the day, it is available to the extent you wish to use it and reuse it. And this was after, of course, the Department of Health and the Department of Environmental Quality had agreed to the outcomes. But it is
Hey, Earl?
available. It is available. Yes.
I just want to let you know you have 2 minutes remaining. Sorry, didn't mean to.
It is available for it. Thank you very much. It is available for irrigation, or it is available for potable use. Now, a project was accepted. In this one, we all have this conversation, which is the audience that says, "I will accept no risk." And in this case, what I would point out to you is, frankly, dissecting that statement, "I will accept no risk." This was a situation where lead counsel for Pfizer had said, gee, we're interested in going on a brownfield, but we don't want any additional environmental risk. Well, we all understand that no risk is not necessarily the outcome anywhere, but so you start dissecting it and looking for ways to, sort of frankly address that risk. And I think just breaking it down is an important part of the lesson and a tip that I would offer. I'll skip the basics because we all know them. These were some clever quotes. The attorney-client privilege in the risk conversation is important. You've all heard this before, but I do think there are times, and I say make sure it's considered, because obviously you don't need to put the lawyer in the middle of this conversation each time, but I think it can have great importance, particularly if you don't know where the risk is going and or how the risk communication is going to be received, how well it will be received. So, again, identifying are you going to try to include drafts under attorney-client privilege? Who should generate that draft? Who should it be distributed to maintain the attorney-client privilege? What is the form of the communication as it goes out? These are all basics. I know you've talked through these things in this group repeatedly, so I won't belabor. Finally, there are a couple things that we have had. I would say of all of these, know who's in the room and make sure that there is clarity on the chat function, particularly if you're doing a risk-based public meeting or public hearing. We've had any number where the chat function was frankly misused and became a distraction during the public hearing, where it's like 20 people sitting in the corner of the public hearing room talking when in fact the principal speaker is still trying to move on. And I will stop there. I think I've taken up my time, but thank you very much.
Like Dave Foss said at the beginning, the breakout sessions are always fun and a nice part of these EBC sessions. And actually, we could have used more time in ours. The next speaker is Janet Keating Connolly. Janet's LSP at Arcadis with over 30 years of experience in hazardous waste site cleanup, which has included risk assessment and risk communication. She also develops community training programs. Her talk will focus on a new approach to effective risk communication that relies on a model of responsive listening and creating trust and connecting to audiences. It's all yours, Janet.
Great. Thank you for the opportunity to share my experiences in risk communication with you today. I've been involved in risk assessment, risk communication, and risk management for 32 years as an environmental consultant, working for responsible parties and community groups. Guidance documents for risk communication have been published by EPA, state agencies, Rutgers University originally, and other groups since at least 1988. The most recent update in 2020 to the ITRC Risk Communication Toolkit is a great summary of principles and best practices from the last 3 decades. The key is planning all of your communications. But what I want to talk about is when you are in the moment and things are not going according to plan. I will share an experience I had at a public meeting, because this particular experience, I learned a lot about risk communication, and it underscores the key message of my talk today, which is this: creating trust and connecting with audiences requires you to be in the moment, listening to your audience and responding to them. About 8 years into my career, I was asked to be on a panel at a public meeting to discuss odors from a landfill. Every time it rained, this landfill would produce persistent odors. This was a real quality of life issue for the residents. My job that night was to talk about the chemicals that cause odors, odor thresholds, which are the concentrations at which you can smell something in air. And the take-home message was, just because something smells bad does not mean it poses a risk to health. I was about 10 minutes into my presentation, and there was one particular woman in the audience who kept looking at me very intensely. And as I was scanning the room for understanding, she would always catch my eye and hold my attention. And I thought to myself, there is no way she is that interested in odor thresholds. There's something else going on here. So I stopped the meeting. It was a natural break. And I said to the group, okay, are there any questions about what I've discussed or other concerns? And that was the opening that this woman needed. She spoke softly, but she had a very important question to ask. And she said, I live on Pendleton Street, and I've lived with these odors for a very long time. I am a breast cancer survivor. My neighbor has breast cancer. My aunt has breast cancer. Did this landfill cause our cancer? Well, what did I do in that moment? And I was silent, which actually is not the worst thing. And part of why I was silent was because I didn't know exactly what to say. I knew what not to say. Hey, didn't you just hear me? I told you odor thresholds have nothing to do with risk. That would be the wrong answer. But while I was being silent, the other reason was I needed more information from her about what the concerns exactly were and how I could help. And the 2 things I did while I was listening was I maintained eye contact with the speaker, with the resident. And the other thing I did was entirely nonverbal. My arms were down by my side, and my hands were open, and my shoulders were down. I was ready to receive the information she wanted to share. And I needed to hear more about what she wanted us to do. And that's the other reason to listen. The guidance documents will tell you all communication should end in some type of action. And the action for this situation was that we were going to have another meeting. And the agency that had prepared a public health assessment for the landfill could come back and talk to the community and this person and share their knowledge about cancer incidents.
Hey, Janet, I hate to cut you off.
Yeah.
I just want to make sure you're not meaning to advance your slides.
I do not mean this. This is
Okay.
all part of, yeah.
Just making sure.
No, I
Thanks.
appreciate that. And
Yeah.
we'll get there in a minute. So,
No problem.
you know, it was not really until years later that when I started taking training on responsive listening, a term we'll define, and empathy, that I was able to go back and understand why this meeting worked out okay. And empathy skills, empathy requires perspective taking, being non-judgmental, communicating your understanding that person, and being open to that person, and recognizing their feelings. And relating to others is intuitive. It's, you know, humans naturally seek connection, and empathy skills can be taught. They are teachable. And we may have lost that component of risk communication because of fear of the outrage of the public, fear that we may not be understood, fear that our risk communication may not be successful. So let's talk about successful risk communication. And we'll start by defining risk communication. The National Academy of Sciences defines risk communication as an interactive process of exchange and information and opinion among individuals, etc. It's not a one-way flow of information, it's a dialogue. We want to inform and involve the public productively in decision-making. The goal here is to commit to a shared understanding of the information on which you're going to make decisions. And EPA describes it here, to raise the level of public discussion about risk to the point where the nature and severity of the risk is generally understood. And to me, I interpret that to mean the outrage is dampened, okay? Once you have a better understanding. Doesn't mean they have to agree with you, but they have to understand where you're coming from. And then we can start focusing on what's the best solution? How do we make decisions now that we have that shared understanding? In terms of effective risk communication, the old model, pre-2007, they defined success from the point of view of the senders. If the message gets across, the communication was a success. Experts were enlightening or persuading the uninformed public. Well, around 2007, a newer model is emerging and encompasses these 5 things, which are really important: enhancing the knowledge and understanding of the subject, building trust and credibility, encouraging constructive dialogue, producing appropriate levels of concern, and then providing guidance on protective behavior and actions. And that means we want to do something. Like I say, communication needs to result in action. And how do we get there? By engaging in this process. So my presentation is going to talk about an underused approach to meet the goals of effective risk communication. And this approach relies on communications model of responsive listening. Responsive listening is being in the moment, okay? And listening to what your audience needs are and responding to that. The rest of my talk is divided into 4 sections: creating trust. It's about listening, okay? Connecting with audience. It's about the audience. I'll share 2 videos of risk communication experiences, and then I'll describe practice exercises for developing responsive listening skills. Okay. Trust is created through transparency. Why are you speaking? You know, are you the Board of Health lead? Are you from EPA? Are you representing the responsible party? Acknowledge that point of view. And tell people what you're trying to achieve with your talk. State your objectives of the presentation so they know exactly what you're going to talk about. And there are always stakes involved. So you need to say why you're there and who is paying for you to be there. That's a colloquialism. What I really mean by that is, you know, why are you there? Who do you represent? Because that does influence your presentation and the information. And people want to know it. They're already asking that question when you get up to speak. So go ahead and tell them right at the top. And then limit yourself to key messages. I came to that meeting to talk about odor thresholds. Other things happened, but we were able to get back on track to that agenda and continue to discuss the primary topic. There will always be another meeting, another opportunity to communicate. Trust is created through credibility. You need to select the person who's fully informed and prepared to speak on whatever that topic is. Okay? And that speaker needs to care about what they're saying so that the listener cares about what they're saying. Okay? They need to have internalized the objective of risk communication, which is to inform, not to persuade. People can smell a sales job from miles away. Okay? Be honest, tell them what you know, right? Convey your knowledge of the subject matter. Trust is created through listening. And this is where we start putting a little more meat on the bones of that responsive listening idea. Trust is built through listening and supporting each other. And I've highlighted here, meet people where they are at and build from there. So I was supporting a community group through a technical assistance grant. And we're having truly a coffee meeting in someone's house. And they had spent the week reading the remedial investigation report. So they were doing their homework. And they had questions for me like, okay, what's a zone 2 around the drinking water well? What does that mean? And one person said, well, I want to know more about aquifers. Well, it doesn't matter that it's aquifers. What matters is that person wants to know, that they're reading and they're learning. And so you just meet them where they're at and you build up from there. And people are going to bring their own perspectives and they're going to worry about things that you might not worry about. That's okay. You need to honor and respect each idea and try to incorporate that into the dialogue that you're having. And trust comes when your listener knows you're truly listening to them. And one way to do this, to acknowledge it, is to repeat what they said, because it forces you to internalize what they said and you're letting them know that you heard it. And then you're reacting to what they said, not what you think they should be asking. And then repeating also kind of builds impatience. It gives you a little bit of time to take it in. And then repeating what they say, you let go of what you wanted to say. And then you're hearing them. And that's how you be in the moment. When you actively listen to someone, you find ways to agree with them. That's when effective risk communication can occur, because you're in a relationship with them and you're having a dialogue. I want to offer some very practical tips for when you're in that public meeting, you're in the moment. There are things that you can do sort of to keep you on track and then maybe regain control if that's happening to you. So connecting with your audience, know your audience is rule number 1. There are always multiple audiences at any presentation that you give. It's nothing monolithic, right? And people will have multiple agendas and you're going to do your homework. And your meeting that you're having is part of a larger communications plan. This one meeting is just one meeting. There are meetings before it and there'll be meetings after it. You've identified who needs to hear the message. What are the messages? They're well crafted. And you're trying to target each of your audiences with these messages. Okay? Very practically, look at your audience. Don't hide behind a projector and all look forward to a screen. Face the audience, make eye contact. Speak clearly, succinctly, confidently. How do you do that? Well, you've prepared all your messages and then you've aggressively edited them. Be aggressive about that and share those confidently. You'll know that you're on target because you've done your homework. Some other ideas, I'm just going to pick up a couple of these just to be mindful of time. The one thing I see a lot is movement without intention. Plant your feet. Okay. There's this pacing that sometimes occurs. And when you're pacing and you think you're sort of, reaching out to the audience, what they're seeing is a little bit of nerves and they're not sure why you're moving. Can you move during a presentation? Of course you can. It will come naturally that if there's a break in or change in a topic, you might move, plant your feet again, and then address the audience. But it can be distracting and we want people focused on your message. I get this question a lot about my hands. What should I do with my hands? Nothing. Okay, forget about your hands. If you're fully prepared and you know what you want to say, and you've practiced, and you should be well rehearsed, your hands will just take care of themselves. Imagine you're at dinner with your college roommate, okay, and you're talking about that time that they took the furniture out of the lounge and you all got together and had a petition to get in a new couch, or your hands will just naturally follow your emotion and your energy. And that's what will happen too when you're presenting in public. Breath is very important. And I've put a couple of examples here. Breath allows you to pause. And people are afraid of silence. Embrace the silence. The amount of time that you're quiet seems much longer to you than your audience perceiving that. And you can use silence to bring people back into a conversation as well. Another way to use breath is to regain control. A little quick breath for yourself, and also, as we know from yoga, deep breathing exercises, reducing stress. You do not want to be doing deep breathing exercises in the middle of your presentation, in and then slowly breathing out. That's something you do beforehand as you're getting ready for your talk. That's something you do before you go out and speak. But, deep breaths and relax yourself, and you'll come across much more relaxed for the audience. You can also connect through word choice. And I got this slide from the Michigan State University, and they do a nice job. They identify the scientific term, the public meaning of that term, how the public might interpret it, and then a better choice. And so I'll just pick out a couple of these that are worth talking about, because I know I've used all of these words one time or another and not gone to the better choice. And that's part of your editing process. But one here is theory. You see in the second half of the slide says theory. People are going to ask you, well, why do you know that the groundwater is flowing that way? Well, I believe in gravity. Gravity is technically a theory, but we all pretty much adhere to it. It is better to use the term scientific understanding, because people might hear theory and think, well, they don't really know. They're kind of speculating. So we want to try to use the term scientific understanding. The other term that I hear all the time, particularly when we're doing risk communication, is 1 times 10 to the minus 6. And I'll also hear, 10 to the minus 6, because we're also used to using it. But that's us, the environmental consultants and engineers and scientists. But we don't speak in scientific notation. I don't use that every day, right? So I don't say, oh yeah, I'm number 73. Can I have 2 times 10 to the 0 pounds of roast turkey? Yeah, and thinly sliced, please. I mean, that's not how we talk. So this is a hard one, because it's not an easy thing. Oh, it's 1 in a million. What you need to do is engage in a process where you're explaining risk assessment and the risk assessment process. This is going to take a little bit of effort, and this might be something you choose to do before you have a large public meeting. This might be a workshop that you offer so that people are kind of on the same page, and there's a number of people in the audience who are like, oh yes, I know what 1 times 10 to the minus 6 is now. Okay, and then you'll bring along others as you proceed.
Hey, Janet, just a couple of minutes left.
Oh, really? Okay. Well, let me show a couple of videos since we have a little bit of time.
I was up front with DEP, and after presenting a work plan for risk assessment, a woman in the audience stood up and she said, well, I don't know much about risk assessment, but I think that this young woman, pointing to me, is going to do a good job. Would you come back and tell us what you found out? Will do. I am crushing this meeting. Then suddenly the double doors to the back of the room are forced open. A latecomer to the meeting rushes up the center aisle to take the one remaining seat in the front of the room. The witness for the prosecution had arrived. This witness left her house in a hurry to come down to the meeting, and I knew this because she had curlers in the back of her hair and a house coat zipped up to there. I have a question, she said, pointing to me. I've been reading about lead and arsenic and soil in the newspaper. My cat has been missing for 9 days. I think the soil killed my cat. And what are you going to do about that? That woman over there thinks I'm doing a good job. This woman alleges I killed her cat.
Jackson, we time for one more video.
I'd say go for it.
Recently, I gave a talk on PCBs in building materials at a women's prison. At a women's prison. You may be surprised to learn this about me. I have never been to prison, never binged Orange is the New Black. What I know about prison I got from Law and Order, and the one thing for certain you are not supposed to do is make eye contact. Attendance at this meeting was voluntary. There were about 60 inmates seated in folding chairs in the gymnasium at the prison. I was at front, the environmental director stood here, and the warden. 8 correctional officers stood guard along the wall of the gym, flanking either side of the exit doors. There was no barrier between me and the inmates except for about 15 feet of air. An air moat separated us. When it came time to ask questions, the inmates would yell over each other, a lot of over-talking. No, it's my turn. No, you get to ask. No, Brenda, go ahead. You get to ask the next question. Brenda sat in the front row, and she had a lot of questions for me. If PCBs are toxic, why do they use them? These studies in animals, they're rats and mice, right? And how do PCBs affect people? Brenda and I are making eye contact, and we are locked.
Oops. So what I was going to say there is we are locked in conversation. And the take-home message from those videos is that the questions Brenda was asking me, even though I was in a prison, and they were an angry group, there's no doubt about it, because of what was happening to them, they were being moved out of where they were living to a different cell block, and that presents a risk to them physically. And so there was a lot of anger there, but we were able to have a dialogue. And what I learned was that the list of questions that Brenda was asking, I've heard those same questions at my other public meetings. So don't underestimate people's ability to engage in the process, to be informed by what you have to say, and then to participate with you fully.
Thanks, Janet. Ms. Carol Boyce, she'll present about communicating in environmental justice communities, including describing what an environmental justice community is, examples of risk communications in EJ communities, and effective communication concepts. Carol is president of her own firm that she started in 1998. She has a master's in public health and is a LSP. She has recently worked extensively in the South Framingham, Massachusetts EJ community. All yours, Carol.
Thank you, David. And thank you to EBC and the speakers who went before me, because they're all really, really excellent speakers, good points. We have till 11 o'clock. I'll try to meet that deadline. I have 27 slides. If you're counting, I'm able to do speed speaking. So a lot of them are photos. I'll give you the first overview. I'm just going to really focus on the first 3 bullets here, because a lot of people I've found recently, especially LSPs, really don't have a clear understanding of environmental justice communities and how to do risk communication in those communities. So I'll give you some examples. And then the other really important takeaway right now is not to underestimate the impact of the pandemic. It's really going to affect our ability to engage with these communities. And the more you understand about the community, the more you'll see that. I mean, I think we all think there's going to be a vaccine. We know there's a vaccine. And I think, innocently, even last year, I was thinking we'll get a vaccine and things will go back to normal. That's not going to happen. It's not going to happen For a lot of us, we're seeing that, but even more so, there are huge impacts to the environmental justice communities who are already struggling with major health inequities. And I'll talk a little bit more about that in a few minutes. But keep that in the forefront of your mind, because the impacts that are going on from the pandemic are going to last for a very, very long time for the EJ communities. So the concept of environmental justice, you've probably heard this before. I don't know if people know, it's a federal policy that came in with Clinton in the 1990s. And we have a state environmental justice policy where all people have the right to be protected from environmental pollution and to live in and enjoy a clean and healthy environment. And as you know, I'm an LSP. I think the LSPs are practitioners here. We all need to recall this is why we're in it. If you don't remember that, go back and watch Dark Waters, a movie about PFAS. Go and back and read A Civil Action. And it will wake you up to why we're doing this. This is a really key slide. Just a little aside, you're going to get a poll. Don't forget at the end of this. So there are 3 criteria. These are described criteria, defined criteria in Massachusetts. And there used to be 4 criteria, but now there are only 3. So the 3 are economic, minority, and English language isolation. Median, now again, these are also based on 2010 census information, which is really old. We all know there's a 2020 census coming out. It probably, of course, won't be out till 21. And again, the COVID information that we're getting, or the COVID effects, are probably going to even change the 20 more than we have knowledge of in 2020. So I could explain that later too. But economic is a median household income, which is less than 65% of the statewide median. The statewide median household income is about $80,000. So hopefully my math is right. And it's about $52,000 a year to meet that criterion. The minority function is 25% or more of the residents in a census tract. Again, these are by census tracts. And 25% or more of the residents identify as a race other than white. And then the last criterion is the English language isolation, which is that 25% or more of the households in that particular census tract have no adult that speaks English or speaks English very well. So I've actually suggested to my last talk about this in December for the LSP Association that people go and look at their sites, look at their locations, look at where they live, and go to the state's environmental justice viewer, which is a really very user-friendly MassGIS. If you just Google MassGIS environmental justice, it should pop up. There's a whole web page about it, and you have a link to the viewer where you type in your address, and then you can see what's going on either in the address and the local area, the census tract that your site is in, or in your community or your area. So this is just, I just took a screenshot of the Northeast region. And I'll talk about these different color coding in the next slide. So the color coding, honestly, to me, doesn't make any sense whatsoever. If you're colorblind, it's probably awful. But the yellow is minority, green is income, as we talked about those criteria before, minority income and English isolation. And then any permutation of that. So you may have a census tract that has 2 of those, meets 2 of those criteria. And the purple, I draw your attention to the purple because that means you have all 3, that census tract meets all 3 of those criteria, minority income and English isolation. So when you take a glance, for example, here's the central region of Massachusetts. If you look up, say, along Route 2 in Orange and Athol, they have income, they meet the income criteria for an environmental justice area. These smatterings of yellow are areas that meet the minority population. And again, I draw your attention to the purple, which is down here in the central, middle of your screen there, which is Worcester, and also in Framingham, where we have areas, census tracts that meet all 3 of those criteria, as well as 1 or 2 or of those criteria. So if you drill down into Southeast Framingham, this is an area actually that was even targeted by Mass DEP for assistance to the community because of the fact that we had so many hazardous waste sites, very significant ones. We have a 20-acre MGP, manufactured gas plant site. We have a major 17-acre park with lead contamination, and we have the general chemical facility, which was a former corrective action. you can see that they're all in this area. And the only reason you'll see this purple, which again are all three criteria, and you'll see this little white area. And the reason for that white area where there's a census tract that doesn't mean anything is there's really a gigantic wetland in here, which prevents has actually received a lot of contamination from the general chemical site, but is not built up. So you don't have the percentage of the population that you would need. So I guess luckily for the area, there at least is some green space, which is the wetland. So in Framingham, I'm working with the board and to try to prioritize and pay attention, because as you know, in a local setting, they're quite politicized, as well as concerns about health impacts. And the way we looked at this was and not many LSPs have the luxury of doing this. You launch into a community, you land there, you jump in and you jump out. For me, this has been eye-opening. I've lived in Framingham for over 30 years, and I had no idea until 10 years ago when I started working with the health department. We had this many sites. We had over 600 sites, 500 at the time. And what I did with the Mass GIS person who works at DPW is we plotted these open and closed sites. Now, the red is the active sites. I think they're actually undercounted here because we have about 50 active sites. I felt that the orange sites, which are again, they don't come up very clearly, but they're AULs, or activity and use limitations, which will require future attention, placed up against the three criteria that I mentioned before, 1, 2, or 3. So on a gray scale. So now you can see the areas that are meeting one environmental justice criteria, the light gray, up to the dark gray, which is that purple area down in southeast Framingham. And you can see this is the old railroad track. It runs, east to west along Waverly Street or Route 135. And again, the old industrial area of town. This is not a surprise, but it still brings home what these communities are faced with just from hazardous waste site. This doesn't include traffic, noise, air pollution, all the other insults that are actually included in environmental justice issues. It's not just hazardous waste sites. I'll quickly flip through some slides here about what an environmental justice site looks like. I mean, you know what they look like, but imagine living in an area. This is very close to one of our big sites. It's across the street from a residential residential apartments. It's a neighborhood salvage operation, legitimately permitted, but piles of metal. There's trucks going in and out daily, and all kinds of noise and dust. And there's one of the former general chemical properties, which had a fire maybe 4 or 5 years ago. It was left as a blight. It was never torn down. It was never fixed up. It was just boarded up and left there. This is a photo from our former health director who was out when the general chemical facility was operating. This site is adjacent to the largest elementary school in Framingham. These two sites, actually, the school and the facility, you may ask, why would you put a school there? Well, they didn't. The school was there approximately the same time as an oil terminal started, and they both grew up since the 20s together. Again, an old industrial area that then morphs into new problems. The contamination, primarily chlorinated solvents with some PFAS, which has been identified now, is in the groundwater, but is a very large plume that extends hundreds of feet, actually maybe even 1,000 feet down gradient, and under these houses, which were then purchased by General Chemical up to 10 or actually 20 years ago. We had to mark them, ask the state to come in and mark them with this X, as you see on the building, because it's too dangerous for first responders to come in. Again, this is right on the main street next to the elementary school that kids walk by when they go to school. Another house that had groundwater contamination. It had a groundwater treatment system even in the basement until the facility purchased the house after a lawsuit with the owner. But the good news is, after actually between 10 and 20 years, that there was a small victory where the town really worked hard to try to get these buildings knocked down, and they just in the last 2 to 3 weeks were demolished. And literally, this is the biggest thing that's happened in this area that's visual for the community, and it means a lot. So I'll quickly go through some types of information. We have both a large Hispanic population and a Brazilian population. So when we do these meetings, we have professional translations that were happening in Spanish and Portuguese with live headsets. And we use local translation services and some other issues. But again, we all have translation problems. With the pandemic and Zoom, translation is a huge problem. There's some example topics. I think that, Janet talked on this, spoke about this a little bit, is, answer the questions that the community wants. Don't go in and just spout information to them. Spend a little bit of time on the PowerPoint or whatever your presentations, but listen to what they want. The health department worked on developing a Q&A we thought would be helpful for the school community, which all had to do with what is your child getting exposed to? And we had a fact sheet, and then we also had information on where to go to get that. I spoke about this earlier, the inequity issues that are going to remain long-term in health, housing, and economic and education are all going to remain for these communities. I mean, most of us here, we can work by Zoom, we can continue to work, we get our salaries, et cetera. However, there are people that have to go out to work every day. There are people that don't have sick time and have to go to work even when they're sick, which has really resulted in the higher impacts to those communities. In the COVID world, there's a few things that are positive, but mostly negative. And I'll boil it down here. There are many more than this. I like the fact that remote access makes attending an evening meeting a lot easier at the general chemical facility public meetings that were PIP sites, it's public information plan sites. We had to even find daycare for people. They didn't have childcare. So if we wanted the community to come to the meeting, we had to go and find childcare, which the state and the PRP were not willing to do. We had to go scramble to find it. We actually got the high school students to come in and help us out on that one. But the cons are very great. And the biggest one, besides the live translations, I think, is that there's already more problems in the environmental justice communities because of COVID. So the attention, when you want to try to get their attention, it's going to be very limited. And this is a place where I think the local officials, like the health department or other local officials can really help. I pulled this out of the paper from last week. This is out of the Metro West Daily News. This is what's happening in Framingham. Their lowest paid workers are struggling. Now they're even worse. The immigrant community, we have a huge, like I said, Brazilian population that comes from far away, does a lot of the work in town, has really helped our restaurant community and, the landscapers, all kinds of, workers that we need in our communities. They go into town because Framingham has public transportation. They have to take public transit. They might not have cars. So here's a classic, this is a chart that, really woke me up when I looked at this. It was shocking. The blue is the percentage of COVID cases on each one of these ethnic groups. And, by race and ethnicity. And 42% of our cases in Framingham are from the Hispanic community. Well, if you look down here, they only represent 20% of our population. So they're definitely bearing the brunt of this pandemic. This is being played out across the country. So it's a really serious problem for the community, and it will reflect on how well you can actually engage that community right now. So the attention is on the acute, it's not on the long-term health risks. This is why I guess I'm making a plug for trying to make a connection with the local officials who have become the default advocate for the environmental justice communities. They may know areas that you can link in. For example, in Framingham, we have a Brazilian radio station. You could go on, and again, that would take a translation, but you would be able to announce meetings, for example, that way, or to go to Brazilian churches, which bring in the community also. So I'm really making a plug here for stakeholders trying to get together, the state, DEP, the responsible parties, the attorneys, and the local officials and the consultants to work together to try to reach. This is not only to provide information to people, but the concept I think Janet was trying to bring out is that you want to foster collaboration. You want them to be decision makers with you. They're the ones that are really, you know, you may think you have the control of the information, but giving them control of the information allows them buy-in and a much better, stronger feeling for their own community involvement. So I guess in closing, I would say, you know, to increase your the public involvement, just think about this. Think about your sensitivity to economic, cultural, language barriers. Work with local officials. They'll give you the political aspect of things, and no alphabet soup. Forget that IRA and RAM and all that. I think that's fundamental. I think people understand that. And I'd echo other people other speakers as saying, you've got to bring this into yourself. You've got to internalize that they are just as important as you are, that you think, a lot of times we think we're problem solvers, we're going to solve your problem. You've got to come at it with a respect for the community and the troubles and the struggles that they're having right now, especially. This has already been said a few times, trust, acknowledging the emotional component, which we all, you know, as scientists and engineers, we might not be very good at. We always default to our, I'm going to solve the problem brain, as opposed to I'm going to listen and try to understand, even if I think it's crazy, you know, I'm going to try to listen to what you have to say. And if I can't address your concern, I'll try to figure out a way to help you with that. So these are all the points that I've made before, especially about mapping your sites on the GIS viewer and increasing your communication time and partnering with local officials. So I'd like to thank the directors that I've worked with. There's been quite a few of them, but Ethan Mascoop was very instrumental in waking me up to a lot of the environmental justice issues in Framingham. And I love this quote at the end, which is, these people are members of the community that care about where they live. So what I hear when I'm being yelled at is people caring loudly at me. And that's the end of my talk. Thanks.
Thanks, Carol. And thanks to all the other presenters. And Michelle will take over and moderate the discussion.
Thanks, David. And thanks to all of our presenters. That was really great information, and I'm sure lots of practical tips for our audience. I didn't see very many questions in the chat, so I will take the opportunity to kick off with a couple of questions, but feel free to chime in if you have a question using the chat feature, or just like wave your hand and I'll try to see you if you have your video on. I think that would be helpful. So the easy one Carol just answered, which is there was a question back to Carol about that building that had the big X and it was condemned, and whether that was because of the physical state of the building or the presence of chemicals. And it's the physical condition of the building, not the presence of chemicals, even though we know there are some chemicals there as well.
Can I add something to that, Michelle? Even though it was just that they were they were dangerous to go into first responders, there were 4 houses that were, you know, basically condemned and just left there. What happened was it became the representation of the contamination. So people couldn't differentiate. This is a classic, what Janet referred to as, you know, they kept asking DEP, why can't you take those houses down? Well, of course, because nobody was in them. Once the imminent hazard was removed, in other words, the people were made to leave their houses, you know, the houses were purchased or whatever, they still stayed as a reminder of a problem there. And people could not understand why the state wouldn't do anything, which again, then that's when it's really important. If I had been the PRP, I would have said, you know what, for 50 grand, knock those houses down, because that'll buy us some good credit with the community, even though it's not related to the contamination. I mean, it was chump change, honestly, in the grand scheme of things. You know, for, I don't know how much of a lawyer's fee, maybe you could tell me, Michelle, you know, you could knock those houses down. So, or a consultant fee. I mean, I'm just saying that, you know, it became this constant reminder, and then, but that became a victory, but it also, people haven't forgotten about it, but that will buy the community now, I mean, the town, because we worked really hard to get that down. In fact, the health department had to work with the building department to do a, a demolition order. So
Yep. Yeah, good point. So I want to follow up to something that Shannon was discussing early on. It seems like a long time ago that you made your presentation, Shannon. I think I'm going to have a related question to Earl, because it goes to your point about building trust and credibility, and acknowledging the situation. So acknowledging, I think you mentioned, acknowledge prior misbehaviors, current problems. And I wonder how you deal with that. And maybe this is a question for Earl, or, the lawyers in the room, so to speak. How do you deal with that and think about liability and admissions or not? Like, you don't want to put your client in the position where you're, out in a public meeting and you're saying, we caused this, sorry, but we're going to fix it. But you're trying to engage the community, you're trying to build trust, you're trying to acknowledge there was a wrong, and I'm using that term loosely, obviously. So how do you get around that? And like I said, I'll ask Shannon first, and then maybe Earl, if you would chime in from the legal perspective, that would be great.
Yeah, pardon me. It's a good question, and certainly times that we've been faced with that. I think more often what you want to do is get ahead of that. If not be surprised or responding to that question in a public meeting, have some written information out ahead of time, where, and certainly, part of the preparation piece is the, making sure that your legal is looking at what your answers are. And so, we can cover the legal part of it, that we're not going to say anything that, would come back to haunt somebody in the future. But, I think it's, again, admitting what you're being honest, open, and frank. Yes, that happened, and we're not going to do that anymore. And then quickly, more importantly, is trying to move the conversation forward. That's what I always say. Let's focus on, maybe what we have accomplished, but also what we're going to accomplish. And, one of the most, what's the word I'm looking for? One of the most impactful things that we can do on, I work on a lot of hazardous waste sites, and sometimes we have a rendering of perhaps what the site might look like when we're done. And that seems to be very powerful. That gets people thinking about what's going to happen and what it's going to look like and how great it's going to be. And we can move forward from perhaps some of those troubles that we've had in the past or misunderstandings.
What do you think, Earl?
So, no, Michelle, I think it's a great question. My experience, and I'll draw from three that are very different. One was a very nasty petroleum-based release in proximity to a public water supply that needed to be addressed and remediated, audience hostile. Second was the Wasatch Front situation. And the third that I had in my presentation was, some stuff on the Pfizer facilities. So in each of those, what I have found, notwithstanding the fact that lawyers ranked pretty low on that scale of communicators, there are times when we find ourselves as at least one of, if not the communicator in matters. And what I have found is setting up, a very tight schedule, a very aggressive schedule. We were reporting in the petroleum release situation, we were reporting publicly and had committed to make public reports as to the status, as to the conditions on a rolling basis that was every 4 hours through the clock. And that was because of the speed with which the plume was moving and the conditions that we were pulling up. And frankly, I found that living by that schedule and presenting the facts, not necessarily the culpability, but the facts, was trust building in part. People ask good questions. And the same has been true in the others. With the Wasatch Front matter, I know for 6 years I was probably back and forth to Utah once a month for a week. And there were various audiences that had to be met with throughout that period of time. But it was the regularity of the communication, the transparency of the effort, but that communication involved what we were doing, what we would be doing, what the results were from what we had done. And what we hoped was, again, to to Shannon's point, what was the vision at the end? And at times we couldn't report much of a vision because it hadn't gotten to that point yet. There was a hope, but not a vision. So, again, being transparent on that front as well.
So I guess similar sort of related question, and I think I'm going back to each of you, Shannon and Earl, for your thoughts on this. But Shannon, you talked about, putting and following up what you just said earlier. Yeah, lawyers were at the bottom of the list. What a surprise, right? In terms of the credibility, and then the environmental consultants were next. But at the top of the list are, the respected local citizens or employees, perhaps of a company that are not management. So how do you engage citizens? Let's forget about the employees or the non-management employees, but how do you get citizens who might be on your side, or even regulators who you need to engage to help you get your message across, without, I don't know.
Yeah,
How do you do that? What are some thoughts on I think getting that, sort of level of agency that you talked about, Earl?
Yeah, and I think there are a couple of different ideas there. One is being, as far as the community, thinking about, so a couple of examples, thinking about who the community might trust. We had a couple of big community meetings in Greenwich, Connecticut. And one of the ideas is we brought in an outside facilitator, actually, and she wasn't a professional facilitator. She was the head of the League of Women Voters, but she had a knack for doing facilitation. And I thought that was really successful because she wasn't seen as somebody who was on any side of the table. She was just somebody known in the community, and she was, perceived as unbiased. So that there's just one example of bringing somebody in who's kind of a little higher on that trust and credibility scale. As far as regulators, my experience honestly has been, developing that sense of mutual respect with the regulators. And once that's done, that the site that I talked about, the 150 homes, pardon me, mostly Spanish speaking. Well, when the site first started, there was definitely a contentious relationship with the regulators. And as we got into the need to talk to the community about the potential risks, we're going to come on your property, we're going to sample your soil for mercury. I mean, that was alarming to a lot of people. And, but getting together our risk assessors with the state risk assessors, and the messaging to the community was developed together. The state was really open to that. They appreciated our background and our experience. They had their own experience, and they certainly had ways they wanted to do things, which we had to respect. And I think once you can develop that sense of mutual respect is when the relationship can go forward and you can work together for the community. Because ultimately that's what it's all about anyways. And hopefully I hit on what your questions were, Michelle.
The only thing that I would add to what Shannon has said is we have always thought about it, every project, every remediation, every crisis needs some allies, and you have to respect what their needs might be. If they're an elected official, the worst thing that they can have happen is the media reports something and their constituents are calling them and asking them why they didn't know, why weren't they in the loop in advance. And so we've often made a point of identifying anyone and everyone who needs sort of an executive briefing in advance of information going public, whether that's to the agencies or whether that's to media, and so that as their phone starts to ring off the hook, they're in a position to respond and respond thoughtfully.
Good point. Carol, I did want to open it up to you, and I know Dave Foss has some thoughts and examples, and there are probably others who do as well. So, Carol.
So I think you have to be really careful. I mean, I'm a real proponent of trying to get, I would say, local officials of some kind. The health department would, in Massachusetts, for example, would, or the county health department, wherever, would be the logical place. Now, some of them won't want to get involved, but to get a local presence, they're going to give you a leg up on what are the politics of the situation. Because if you have the city council against the mayor, you know, if the mayor says something, you need a fast, you know, leg up on what's the situation on the ground. And for example, I could tell you, like with the general chemical site, DEP had very little, you know, thought, you know, respectability or whatever you want to call it, respect by the community, because it had been like 30 years, things had been getting studied and nothing had gotten done. And nobody had been in the community to discuss why that was going on. So in our situation, we had to work at it, because I would say that not even the health department was really that trusted in the beginning, but we had to do repeated meetings in order to get people to even understand what the difference is. They didn't know DEP from the health department, from me, from the, you know, it's all just a big mash of who's out there. Like, I want to yell at somebody. So I think it's really important to touch base, at least, you know, like I think Earl referred to, is like, what's on the ground, what's happening locally.
Hey, Foss, did you have a quick?
Yeah, no, I had an example that I want to share. So this comes from a Superfund site redevelopment in Walpole, but I had a similar experience in Worcester and a slightly different one in Belmont and Cambridge. But the Walpole one was, we had lots and lots of workshops ahead of a big public meeting, and made them at multiple times a day and in the library community room, and made it so people could come and talk and have like really small, like one-on-one or three-on-one conversations. And the benefit of that was huge, so that when you're in a 150 person town meeting, you didn't have to feel like you had to address each and every person, like, you know, by their first name. But so having preliminary workshops was really, really great. But the other example from Walpole, the Superfund site, was that there's a neighborhood group who was really feeling like 50 years of industry and then 30 years of blight, feeling ignored, and the town didn't know what to do. So they appealed and had the EPA make the performing parties set aside some money so the town could hire a consultant. Now I'll say it was me, so I know how this process worked. But then I could be there, and someone, or Janet used the example of like, who are you getting paid by, right? Like, you represent someone. And it was really helpful in this big, complicated Superfund and brownfield redevelopment, that the residents could say, oh, we have an advocate. We have someone that we're paying to be our voice and to translate. So like, the EPA would say stuff, and the EPA wasn't wrong. They weren't lying, but they speak EPA speak. And the performing parties consultants speak performing party preventive limiting liability. And so it was really helpful that the neighborhood residents could feel like they had their own advocate. Now, sometimes that is the health director, or maybe it's someone like Carol who lives in Framingham and is like an LSP in Framingham. But sometimes it might actually facilitate the process if the performing party, the responsible party, say, hey, you know what? We want to make sure that these neighborhood groups know that they're being represented and they have a voice. And so, and it also helped with trust. Like, I had an opportunity to meet people dozens of times so that I knew them by name, and they knew that their voice was being heard at the table. So I think making sure that people feel like their voice is being heard is really key. That was one of Janet's things, like, be an active listener, hear their questions, understand their pain of living in a nasty neighborhood for decades, and then say, okay, how do we help pass that concern on to the people who have to spend the money to clean it up?
Hey, Dave, this is Todd Mahler. I just have a follow-up question to what you just said. It was actually really interesting and really helpful. I guess my first question is, so you mentioned these smaller group sessions. How did you go about coordinating that as far as bringing people together in these small groups? I mean, what was your the venue, or, you know, some kind of that advertisement that you used to facilitate that activity?
Sure. So there would be some big meeting, usually like a board of selectmen meeting with the board of health, like, so a big public televised meeting that says, okay, here's the, I'll say, public involvement plan giant session. But that what would come out of it would say, okay, either just before or just after, we're going to have 2 or 3 workshops, and I would let the health director be the invitor, so they would set it up. But we reserved a room at the library, like a community public space. Right. We'd have posters set up. The performing parties engineer would like, these are all other consultants' engineering information. But it's basically saying, you can come in during this 2-hour window, come and ask any question you want. And we would tell them what we knew. And if we didn't have an answer, we would take the question and bring it to the performing parties. And so before any big vote, like any town meeting vote or big planning meeting vote, we would have 4 or 5 of these sessions. Now, this is pre-COVID, so I'm not sure how easy that could go in Zoom.
Yeah, that was actually my follow-up question is, you know, kind of in the recent climate, right? So how is it that we facilitate something along those lines? So for example, so I'm the GM at Clean Earth in Plainville, Connecticut, and one of the initiatives we're working on is for PFAS, thermal treatment of PFAS soils, right? And so we want to ensure that community involvement, I mean, we've done deposition models, et cetera. We want to make sure that we're communicating this to the community to show that what we're doing is extremely effective. And from a science perspective, it makes perfect sense. But when we start talking about the general public and putting it down to that perspective, communicating that level of science is challenging. And then, you know, in the absence of being able to sit down in a small forum, because I actually really like that idea a lot, to be able to address those in smaller groups and parties. But now that we're kind of in a much different environment, you know, I wonder if anybody has any recommendations on how I could proceed with informing the public instead of, you know, just like I said, it's just kind of a different environment right now. We're trying to proceed. Obviously, we know it's an emerging contaminant. It's an issue. So how do we address it? So we're trying our best to proceed, and we've been kicking around community involvement and the best way to manage that. And we've yet to come up with a great plan as far as what meets the needs of exactly what we're talking about right now.
I think that's a clear case where you'd want to go to your local officials, the people who seem the most plugged in, whether it's the, you know, I don't know what the form of government is, if it's a city councilor in a district, or if it's the health department, or if there are local groups that are, you know, environmental groups. Start small. Dave, I think that's a fabulous idea. And then you'll have to you can have a smaller, more interactive Zoom meeting. It's got to be a Zoom meeting. And, you know, these ones with hundreds of people just aren't going to work. So I think you'll have to probably work harder at it and plan more.
Right.
If I can offer one other thought is maybe if you can bring people in who are already trusted advisors. So that might be like church leaders or head of the school committee or head of the other kind of neighborhood associations, and communicate to them, because they can then give you outreach into their network. And if the community group leader is on board and with you, that really helps smooth the communication to the rest of their constituency.
Right. Yeah, because we do have local. We have reached out to our local first selectmen. I mean, we have town support. That's you know, from the elected officials. That's fine. Now looking at it from a community aspect, right? So everybody's got a sour taste in their mouth from, you know, the old Saint Gobains and, you know, the other, you know, issues from other, we'll just say, environmental, you know, processes gone wrong. And so it's being able to address that to the community. So I think we're good on the local end. It's just now more on the public end, just informing the general public for those that may have concerns and questions. So that was very helpful, but thank you.
So I want to be mindful of time, but I have a couple of additional questions. One of which came from the audience. Nikki, maybe I'll ask you to just unmute yourself and you can ask your question, because I think that's an important one in this current climate that we're in terms of the willingness of people to trust or not science. I see you haven't unmuted. I don't know if you want to ask that question, if you want me to go for it. Okay, I'm not seeing you do it. So I'm going to ask on behalf of Nikki from GeoInsight, asking the speakers to address, and I'll ask quickly, please, because I have one other follow-up I'd like to do. The question of today's change in individuals' willingness to trust science in general, how to overcome this, especially in situations without the ability to bring in a neutral party who isn't paid by one side or the other. Any thoughts on that right now, trusting science? Janet?
So I'm a scientist and I believe in science, and so I'll always express that, and I'm not going to back down from that. But what I would say is find what is common. People believe science, so find out in your listener what it is they do believe in. Start there, wherever that may be, and however far away from your scientific knowledge might be. Find that common ground, and that's where you start with the conversation.
So, Janet, I'm gonna take the opportunity to follow up with you on something you talked about, responsive listening. And that sounds to me really hard to, you're prepared and everybody's talking about being prepared and you need to have your presentation prepared and rehearsed and everything. But you're saying you might need to throw that out the window because you need to listen to what the people's concerns are and the people's questions are and respond to that in the moment. That sounds really hard. I mean, do you have some tips you can give some folks for?
It is hard. So I will acknowledge that it's hard. I will also say that, like Dave was saying, there are a lot of different types of meetings. One-on-one conversations, small group conversations. Where you're going to be least successful will be these large audiences where there's a lot of outrage, maybe the first meeting the community has ever had. So you'll have multiple opportunities to communicate and ways to communicate, different channels that you're going to communicate in. And all of those are opportunities to practice this. Responsive listening is a practice. And I've included in my slides and didn't get a chance to present those, some exercises you can do alone to work on active listening, responsive listening. You can do with another person, or you can do with your project teams. And anyone has any questions about those, you should feel free to just email me and I can talk about how I use these in my practice, practice this idea of responsive listening. It's a skill that can be learned, and the more you do it, the better you get. And the more you do it, the easier it gets. And, again, have a plan for communication, know to whom you're speaking and where and in what channels and through what avenues. And then you can you get control in that way. I also want to point out, you want to control your meeting, right? I mentioned it. You have a message, you want to convey it. You don't want to get waylaid. That can happen. You still have to control the environment, but you can control by still being responsive and still listening to people. And because your goal of being responsive is to build trust. And if you're building trust, then you know what, she didn't answer that question, but I know that she's going to come back around again before this meeting's over and answer it, because that's what she did the last 3 times she was here. So be consistent and let them know that you're reliable and that you're credible. And not everything's going to be perfect, and that's okay. As long as they trust you, they will come back with those questions and you'll get another opportunity to respond in kind.
Michelle, I just want to add, I put it in the chat, but there's a really good book that anybody could use for anything. Spouses, children, parents. It's called Difficult Conversations. And it was Harvard researchers who, write this down, Difficult Conversations. It will save your life. It's very short, very succinct, and it deconstructs what a conversation is. It was done by these researchers who want to understand. It has all the key things that Jay's referring to. It's a really helpful book.
Thanks, Carol. And no, we're out of time. So thank you again to all our presenters. Those were some presentations and some really helpful tips that everybody. It's a reminder that the presentations will be sent to you. And we do ask that you provide feedback on today's seminar. You'll get the link. It's actually already in the chat, I believe. So thank you once again for attending.